interesting business. Often I find myself introducing people whom I've known from publications and I have admired from the distance. But today I have the rare privilege of introducing someone that I know personally and that I admire as a colleague. Dr. Keats Webb is an imaging scientist at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute, the MCI, and she obtained a PhD in the University of Brighton. She is in fact one of the first graduates of the CDT, the Center for Doctoral Training in Science and Engineering in Arts, Heritage and Archaeology, which, as many of you know, is based here in the Institute for Sustainable Heritage. Her research focuses on spectral imaging and image-based 3D reconstructions, and her work is very relevant for all the themes that we discuss in this lecture series. So I'm sure her thoughts on the matter will be really interesting. Keats, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I really appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this lecture series. I attended this as a student as part of the master's and PhD for the Center for the CHAS CDT. So it's very exciting to be here as a lecturer and then to have the opportunity to do this virtually. So I am presenting from Washington, DC. I really appreciated the opportunity to prepare for this talk. And it was a learning opportunity. It allowed me to kind of push myself to think a little bit differently about images. And it allowed me to step back from the narrow focus of my research and work and really reflect on what an image is. And it allowed me to dive into the history and development of photography and think about how we are currently using images and how they have been used in the past. And so this was important, having specialized and narrowed my view for the 6 years of the master's and PhD. And the reflection of this journey and looking at the history and development of photography have helped me come back to the importance of imaging of cultural heritage and the importance of the work that I do. So what is an image? Most of us travel through the world with a camera on us most of the time. We take pictures of our family, our friends, our pets. We document the food that we eat and the places that we go. We memorialize events and achievements. We certify experiences. We're using photographs to provide proof that something happened, evidence of those events and those things that we've done. So images have very much been a part of my life. I have family photo albums and photographs of places traveled, documentations of events and achievements. But I also studied fine art photography in undergrad, and my undergraduate thesis was looking at aging and identity through portraits of my grandmother and self-portraits of myself. I also have worked professionally as a photographer documenting weddings and taking portraits. And for the past 10 years, I've been working in various roles as digital imaging specialist and imaging scientist at the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute. And that's using images to support the research and conservation of heritage objects. In 2014, I moved to London and I started the master's and PhD program through the Science and Engineering and Art Heritage and Archaeology Center for Doctoral Training. And that was focusing on imaging and cultural heritage. And so for 6 years, I lived between Washington, DC and the UK, and that was studying imaging, but also being surrounded by images. So just looking at that most recent past, those several years of the master's and PhD, images have been used to document where I went and who I met and what I did. And I actually sent my grandmother nearly weekly postcards providing photographic documentation of this process, of this journey. I traveled to Amsterdam for a conference, and while there, I had a tintype portrait made that documented, that was using early photographic techniques. During this time, I was also using imaging as part of my master's and PhD research and working with images on a regular basis. And I was also experiencing photography as a fine art and visiting museums that had exhibitions around photography. So when I first moved to London, I used the posters in the tube station to inform kind of the shows and exhibitions that I wanted to see around town. And in 2014, I came across a poster for this show at the Science Museum. It was called Stranger Than Fiction. It was by Joan Fontclaberta. And I liked the idea of the title and the images, but I really didn't know what it was about. But the show did change how I thought about photographs. So Fontclaberta tells the story about discovering these kind of strange archives in the 1980s in Scotland. And they were archives of a zoologist. And the zoologist was doing his pioneering field work in the 1930s and 1940s. And he was documenting these very unique animals. And he was using photographs, and there's catalog descriptions. And so Fontclaberta, his exhibition, this body of work called Fauna, was the story of this zoologist with these various documents. So you have the field recording sheets, the images of the animal in the field, you have x-rays, there's even lab drawings and pictures of these animals in the lab. And so fauna is presented in a museum setting. I saw this in the Science Museum in London, and it was presented with this very convincing material that creates a believable story. And so Fontclaberta, in talking about this work, says you tend to believe that the objects exist because it's a photograph, and photographs are convincing, and photographs have that authority. So the storytelling, the setting, and the presentations of photographs and documents creates this believable story. And Fontclaberta is an artist who was born under Franco rule in Spain. And in a lecture about his work, he discusses the conventional idea about documentary photography, this idea that it's a reflection of the real, that it's evidence, that it's a translation of reality, which should be believed. And so he found that he could use photography as both a tool and a weapon against authority and oppression in a tyrannic regime. And so he had studied communication, both advertising and journalism, and he stated in talking about his work that lying was his profession. So he was using these skills, these communication skills and his experience to create these images to teach people how to react to subtleties of manipulation techniques. So Fontclaberta's use of images tie into storytelling and setting to present this believable story. And so there's an authority to seeing images in a museum setting, and we tend to believe photographs as evidence. And so these are really interesting issues and questions to think about. And my work is not about the creation of these very unique animals and photographing them, but I think it's important to think about our belief of photographs as evidence, the truth of images, and the authority that comes with photography and also photographs in a museum setting. So thinking further about what an image is and looking at the history of photography. So Mary A. Forresta discusses the importance of photography and the meaning of photographs by looking at the history and development of photography alongside the history of the Smithsonian. And that's in her book, At First Sight, Photography at the Smithsonian. And so she describes photographs as becoming central to our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. She describes photographs as being valuable tools of science, history, medicine, education, and commerce, but they're also independent objects of art. And so photography is introduced in France and England in 1839, and it presents new ways of measuring, collecting, and illustrating the modern world. And this is alongside new developments in industrial processes, transportation, and communication. So photography was born into a changing world. And at the same time, photography is seen as an agent of change. So photography changed how things were done, how people saw themselves, how time could be recorded and studied. It also was an agent of change for museums. So it changed how museums were maintaining records of the collections and then also scientific specimen. So photography was used to document museum collections. It introduced a new collection, a new media to be collected and exhibited. It could complement existing displays, and photographs could be used in place of original objects. And photography was also used to promote and communicate information about objects on view. So in addition to museums, photography is an agent of change for art history. So students no longer needed to travel from museum to museum and rely on their memory in order to study these paintings and sculptures around the world. Instead, they could use slides in order to view these works of art. So the Smithsonian's born into the world of photography. It was established in 1846 when Congress accepted the bequest of James Smithson, who was a British scientist, and it was the start of the National Museum, and it was devoted to the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So the start of the Smithsonian is similar to other museums, and it was set out to collect and organize the world. And so photography provided a great tool for doing this, for collecting, for knowing, for showing. And photography was particularly useful in documenting these collections, these objects, and also preserving the past for the future. Thomas Smiley was the first and chief photographer at the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian started collecting objects that were related to the history of photography as early as the 1880s, but this section of photography was established in 1896. Smiley, as a photographer at the Smithsonian, was using this technique, photography, to document installations, to create reproductions for printing illustrations. He was also documenting the construction of new Smithsonian buildings, and he went on scientific expeditions as the photographer for those. He additionally was acting as a chemist and an advisor for the Smithsonian scientific researchers. So in 1913, the first Smithsonian Hall of Photography was established, and Smiley was the one who created the exhibition that was put up there. And he included photographs as documents of history, portrayers of American life, tools of science and technology, and as artistic images. So photography was used early on for scientific applications. In the section in Forrest's book about scientific applications of photography, she discusses how photography serves science by connecting the act of seeing with the thing seen. Photography offered a mirror-like representation of the world, permanent records of scientific observations, and this authority of realism. So it paired as a great tool for scientific applications and observations. And one of the first recorded scientific images was actually taken of the surface of the moon in 1840 by J.W. Draper. There was also early examples of microbes being photographed using a microscope, or other photographic techniques being used to classify plants that were being collected. And so these photographic applications were about producing images for recording, measuring, and interpreting in the fields of science, technology, and medicine. So photography has been used for recording cultural heritage since early in the history of photography. And so the next few slides are going to provide examples of some of the techniques that I use at the Museum Conservation Institute that have longer histories than some might expect. And so I'm using this example of a painting and a wooden curio from the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Indian. And these are standard visible light images to provide you an idea of what these objects look like as I discuss the following techniques, which will provide different views. The painting is by F.W. Rogers and is part of kind of a study collection. He was an American painter, and this is oil on canvas. And then the jaguar curio on the right is a wooden Andean ceremonial drinking vessel that was thought to have been made around 1700 in the highlands of Peru. And the curio will come up later in the presentation too, and I'll provide a little bit more information. So photogrammetry is often used as a general term to present and discuss image-based 3D reconstruction for cultural heritage documentation. And some people consider it a new technique. However, photogrammetry actually has a history that's fairly parallel with the history of photography. And there are a range of different methods that relate to photogrammetry. And so photogrammetry are methods that are based on image measurement and interpretation, using one or more images in order to determine the shape and location of that object. And so photogrammetry as a field is a specialism of geomatics, a scientific field for the collection, analysis, and interpretation of survey data relating to the Earth's surface. And photogrammetry is focused on making accurate 3D measurements from images. The history of photogrammetry goes back to the mid-1800s with experiments by a French military engineer, and he was using images for topographic maps. And then around the same time, a German architect was using images for indirect measurements of building facades starting around kind of the 1850s, 1860s. So while photogrammetry is often the term used, the image-based 3D reconstruction widely used for cultural heritage is actually referencing an automated flexible method based on structure for motion paired with multi-view stereo. And these techniques and current techniques include the integration of photogrammetry and computer vision in an approach that simultaneously and automatically is determining the camera parameters, that the camera calibration and the geometry of the scene using matching and bundle adjustments. So this is an image on the left of the camera positions for that image set in order to create a 3D reconstruction. So this is a more current version of the 3D reconstruction, and each of those blue rectangles represents a camera position. So the reconstruction on the right is made up of over 100 images taken of this object in the round and then processed to create that geometry, the surface geometry of this object. So X-radiography has been used since the 1890s. X-rays were discovered in 1896. And by the end of the 1890s, there was actually a publication about X-radiographs of a Peruvian mummy. So radiography is recording the entire depth of an object. And it has been used as a standard, non-invasive, non-destructive technique for cultural heritage professionals. And that's to document and assess the condition and also the construction of the object. And so it's a technique that can be used on a range of different materials and objects. So textiles, papers, metals, ceramics, bones, fossils, and paintings. UV radiation has been used for conservation investigation and documentation since UV lamps became commercially available around 1925. And one of the techniques established for conservation documentation is UV-induced visible luminescence, and that's also referred to as UV-induced visible fluorescence. So a variety of materials luminesce when exposed to UV radiation, and so this property can be used as a tool for examining and documenting cultural heritage objects. And it's done to characterize and differentiate materials, to establish the condition of an object, and then also to reveal past treatments. And so UV-induced visible luminescence can be observed just with direct visual examination, or it can be recorded with photography. And so objects are irradiated using UV radiation, and some materials absorb that radiation and re-emit the energy at longer wavelengths. And that's what's observed as the luminescence in the visible range. And so this can be helpful with characterizing pigments and resins, uranium glass, tide lines, mold, optical brighteners, and some minerals. Infrared radiation has been used for cultural heritage documentation since the 1930s, when films sensitive to the near-infrared radiation became available. And so IR images are recording the varying reflection, transmission, and absorption of IR radiation by the materials that are in that object. And so these techniques, the infrared imaging techniques, are established as investigative tools for painting and paper conservation. And these can help with revealing underdrawings, detecting changes in composition, visualizing faded or obscured text or features, and characterizing and differentiating materials. So those examples of techniques that are still being used have continued to develop with the advancement of digital imaging technologies and computing capabilities, and also the development of sensors with different sensitivities. So images have long been used for art and science, and they've also long been used within museums. Images have been used to document cultural heritage objects, and they've been used to create scientific records for research and conservation of heritage objects. But there are these issues with photography, questions about truth and reliability of images, which are important to consider when thinking about these images as scientific records. So Errol Morris is a film director who has written on photography and perception in his book, Believing is Seeing, Observations on the Mysteries of Photography. So Morris poses that central issues of photography are questions of posing, photo fakery, reading the intention of the photographer from the image itself, questions about what a photograph means and how it relates to the world it photographs. So Morris discusses these central issues of photography in looking at two images. These are images by Roger Fenton, who was a British photographer, and in 1855, Fenton was sent to photograph the war in Crimea. And so Fenton and his assistant spent 4 months working from a horse-drawn dark room to document the war in Crimea. So the best known images from this time are these two, which are titled Valley of the Shadow of Death. And the photographs are taken from the same position, but one photograph has cannonballs off the road, the one on the left, and the other has cannonballs on the road, the one on the right. So in Morris's essay about these photos, he discusses the questions of sequence. So what image came first? And the issue of posing. Was the photograph posed? Did the photographer change anything between the two images? So one interpretation was that the photograph without the cannonballs on the road was taken first, and then the photographer scattered the cannonballs on the road before taking the second. So if the photograph was posed and the photographer changed something between the two images, was the photographer set out to fool, trick, or deceive? What was the intention of the photographer? So there is, in this essay by Morris, there's this idea that any photography taken in a studio is posed, and that the photographer can't simply be an observer. And going even farther, the argument that every photograph is actually posed because every photograph excludes something. So there's decisions made about cropping, about framing, about the specific time and space that are exposed for that image. So in looking at these two images, is one of these more truthful than the other? Is one of them more authentic? So going back to Morris's words, I would like to make the claim that the meaning of photography is contained in these two images. By thinking about the Fenton photographs, we are essentially thinking about some of the most vexing issues in photography, about posing, about the intentions of the photographer, about the nature of photographic evidence, about the relationship between photographs and reality. How do the decisions that we make when we take photographs influence the truthfulness or authenticity of the resulting image? How might our intentions as photographer and also the influence of our institutions impact the nature of photographic evidence? So Morris brings up these issues of posing, the photographer's intention, and the nature of photographic evidence. But who is taking the picture, the photograph, and who has access to the techniques and the technology? So when photography was first introduced, the technique required specialized equipment, processing, but we see that quickly advancements were made and photography became more widely available. So as early as the 1880s, cameras were available that were preloaded, easy to use, and there was actually commercial mail order processing that was available. And so the introduction of photography reduced the cost of portraiture and also influenced the history of representation. And then the advancements further popularized photography and also made cameras available for wider use. And so if we think in more modern times about digital photography and the availability of digital cameras, so initially that technology was too expensive and out of reach, but as it progressed, digital cameras became more widely available and were used to document kind of everyday lives and take pictures of each other. And even now with thinking about our smartphones and the cameras that are included in those and the quality of those, and that pretty much everyone is carrying a camera around with them. So advancements in digital technologies and advancements in computing have made imaging techniques available also to cultural heritage professionals. So more heritage professionals have these techniques available and on hand. So in talking about the democratization of technology, I want to bring up Cultural Heritage Imaging, or CHI. They're a nonprofit in California, and they're focused on building innovative digital tools and practices for cultural heritage. And their vision is about democratizing technology and empowering people all over the world to document their own cultural heritage. And the documentation of their own cultural heritage is about helping them to preserve and protect that heritage for future generations. So CHI is focused on low-cost imaging techniques in order to create digital surrogates. And the digital surrogates are about a reliable representation of the real world and the potential of that digital surrogate for the advancement and sharing of knowledge. And so the potential for these digital surrogates for both scholarly and scientific applications and objectives are reliant on information about how and why they were made, their digital provenance information. So this information is not actually likely to be recorded, or all of the information is not likely to be recorded in the digitization process. So I bring up CHI both for their emphasis on accessible yet rigorous approaches for creating digital surrogates, and also this emphasis on the importance of digital provenance information that's really important for the current and future reuse of original data and the resulting digital representations. And so to understand digital data and its uses for scholarly and scientific purposes, it's really important to understand the meaning of the data and the information about how and why it was generated. And without that information, that original data or the representation has limited uses. So CHI has been working on developing the Digital Lab Notebook. And this is a digital equivalent of the Scientist Lab Notebook, and it's building a pipeline, a software pipeline, and pulling together open source software and then best practices. And it's capturing information like the imaging subjects, the people involved with the imaging, project stakeholders, related documents, and then information about the image acquisition. So the equipment, the setup, and that configuration. And so the Digital Lab Notebook is about providing data transparency. So data and its reliability can sometimes be tied to who created it and what institution they may be associated with. And so data transparency is about the merit of the data being able to be evaluated on its own, and it's separating scientific reliability from academic authority. And it's allowing the wider use of scientific imaging techniques, and it's not limiting those techniques to just the well-known and larger institutions and museums. And so this is an emphasis on CHI's work with the Digital Lab Notebook and also their training, and this idea that local caretakers, when trained on these techniques and doing them properly, their data can stand up to the data made from some of the most respected and authoritative sources. And that means that, so both the access to these techniques and the data transparency means that more people have the potential of telling their own stories about their cultural heritage, as opposed to a few or a handful of institutions telling other people's stories. So my role as digital imaging specialist and now imaging scientist at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute has been about using a variety of scientific and computational imaging techniques. And that's to support the research and conservation of these heritage collections, these museum objects. And so it's about creating reliable and scientific records of those objects. And so going into some of that information about CHI's work with the Digital Lab Notebook and digital provenance information and the importance of this, I want to walk through an example of an image that I've taken. So if we just have this image with no additional information, whether that's now or someone comes across this image in the future, if we have no additional information, there are a lot of questions. What is this image? What is it taken of? How was the image taken? Why was it taken? And who took this image? And there may be some metadata that's associated with this, but in this case, some of this information is actually not quite correct, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So I'm going to start walking through additional information about this image and the importance of it. So this is the object, is a Wooden curio from the National Museum of the American Indian. It's an Andean ceremonial drinking vessel that was made around 1700. And it was most likely made in the highlands of Peru. It's in the shape of a jaguar head. And while this is unusual, it's not a unique form, and the decoration is atypical. So you see kind of the spots around as the jaguar's fur, there's silver discs for the eyes, there's a ferrous metal band around the neck, and then brass serpents as whiskers. So the National Museum of American Indian has a collection of curios, and senior objects conservator Emily Kaplan has been conducting a long-term technical study of these curios, and that's to understand the materials and manufacture of these objects. And so the imaging was done in collaboration with Emily as part of her ongoing research on the collections of the curios. So a question comes up, why is this black and white? Oh, and the slide jumped ahead a little quickly. So why is the image on the left black and white? So this is a visible light image color of the same view. And so the question might be, is this just a conversion, a black and white conversion? If you just convert the visible light image to black and white, it's actually not the same image that we see on the left. So what is this image? It is a reflected infrared image that was taken with a modified camera. So silicone sensors that are at the heart of consumer digital cameras are actually inherently sensitive to near ultraviolet and also near infrared radiation, but they've been optimized for color photography. And that's by incorporating an infrared block filter over the sensor and then a color filter array on the sensor. And so if you remove those filters, the cameras can actually provide capabilities for spectral imaging, but they retain the handling properties of a consumer digital camera and the user interface that more people are kind of used to. So there's a few different types of conversions. This one happens to be a monochrome conversion, which is the most invasive and destructive, where the IR block filter is removed from in front of the sensor, but then 5 microns of the sensor surface have actually been removed. With this modification, it's now sensitive from near UV to near IR, and it no longer has the color filter array on that, so it no longer is taking color images. This modification is not recorded in the camera metadata. So the camera still thinks that it's a standard consumer digital camera. So it's really important that that information stays with this image in order for it to be interpreted correctly. In addition to the modified camera, I used a filter and the specific illumination source. And so the filter is blocking visible light and passing infrared radiation. And then the illumination source is a Canon flash, which also has infrared radiation output. And this is also information that's not going to be stored in the metadata, but is absolutely important in understanding what this image is recording and what it's showing. This image is actually part of a series to process 3D reconstruction. And so we did series both with the visible light images with a standard digital camera, and then we also did a series of reflected infrared images with the modified camera. And so this image on the left is only one of 141 reflected IR images that were used to process the 3D reconstruction. And so the last question about this, the single image, is why are we looking at the back? So the IR images actually indicate and differentiate 2 different materials that were used in the spots of the jaguar's fur. So one of those materials is absorbing IR radiation and is showing up as a dark gray or black in the IR image. And the second material, which is showing up black in the visible light image, is actually becoming transparent in the IR image. And that's why we're seeing a difference between the IR image and the visible light image. And so this was an indication to the conservator that there was a second material that she may not have been aware of with initial kind of observations of this object. And so this is an example of the importance of the digital provenance information and how it's essential for both the current and future use of the original data and then also the digital representation, that 3D reconstruction. So without that information, this image or the 3D reconstruction really does have limited use. So my work at MCI is about improving the recording of heritage objects. And my PhD research was looking specifically at improving image-based 3D reconstruction for conservation documentation. So as was stated earlier and by Joseph, I was a student as a part of the Science and Engineering and Arts Heritage and Archaeology Center for Doctoral Training. And my research was done at the University of Brighton with support from University College of London. And that was, the advisors were Roger Evans, Stuart Robson, Robert Kessler, and Ian Laidlaw. So the research was investigating the optimization of image-based 3D reconstruction, and that was looking at small to medium-sized museum objects, and specifically improving the image-based 3D reconstruction for conservation documentation. And this was, so accessible consumer imaging systems are definitely being used and adopted by non-expert heritage users. And so we're seeing increasing use of automated image-based 3D reconstruction workflows, and also the use of modified cameras for spectral imaging. So the increase of accessibility from that automation and that modification are actually potentially contributing to challenges of maintaining 3D output consistency. So an aim of the research was improving image-based 3D reconstruction as accurate and reliable scientific records, specifically for conservation documentation. And so this followed kind of three approaches for that optimization. The first was looking at establishing best practices and workflow for the research, looking at wavelength and wavelength selection, and then looking at depth of field and sharpness. The optimization emphasized the photographic image quality of those input images for the 3D reconstruction. And that was looking at local contrast, wavelength selection, sharpness, and focus. And so the truth of these images is about the accuracy and reliability as scientific records. So this part of the research was building on available best practices and workflows. And this was through testing and refining the acquisition, the processing, and the assessment of the image-based 3D reconstruction. And we used two test objects for this. Part of this process was establishing the limitations of the imaging system and the setup that we were using. And that helps to better understand our potential and what we could actually measure or monitor over time. And so a really important part of this research and also the use of 3D reconstruction is the repeatability and comparability of the results. So that measuring and monitoring over time or comparing two objects between two different locations and two setups, it's really important to have repeatable and comparable methods and to understand the limitations of those systems to know what you're even capable of resolving in terms of what you can measure and monitor. So modified cameras are being used for conservation documentation, but the research was looking at and presenting a workflow and application of pairing the modified camera with wavelength selection, and that was to optimize image-based 3D reconstruction. So we were looking at whether wavelengths within or beyond visible light can enhance or can provide an enhanced view of an object or an object feature to improve the recording of that surface shape, that surface geometry. And so we did find that pairing the modified camera with selected wavelengths could improve the consistency of the 3D reconstruction. And specifically, this was using reflected infrared images for this object. So the object included on this slide is a wooden sculpture of a coyote on a turtle, and it's from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And the coyote is dark and shiny, so it's a problematic surface to photograph anyway. But the reflected infrared images increased the local contrast of the crack along the back, which was the area of interest. And it also decreased the specularity to improve the surface recording. So another part included the characterization of the modified camera. We wanted to better understand how the modification was impacting the image quality and the use of the camera as a scientific tool. And so the characterization and learning more about the associated imaging system ensured a consistent imaging quality and capabilities. And this was providing a better understanding of the modification, the use of the camera as a scientific tool, and the spectral capabilities, what the spectral sensitivity was of that camera. And so with the camera characterization was looking at the 2D image quality and also the spectral sensitivity of the camera. So the other component of the research was looking at depth of field and sharpness in order to optimize image-based 3D reconstruction. So the 3D reconstruction process assumes that an object is acceptably sharp throughout the input image set, but limited depth of field is an issue with both close-up 2D and 3D imaging of three-dimensional objects, and that's particularly the case with smaller objects. And so this slide is showing more of a limited depth of field on the left, where the rim of the vase is in focus, but the base is not. And then we see like a more extended depth of field on the right image, where the rim is in focus and the base is also in focus. And so depth of field is well understood in the context of 2D imaging, and it's definitely thought about and considered when acquiring images for image-based 3D reconstruction. But depth of field and the calculation for the 2D imaging are not well connected with that required range of acceptable sharpness for 3D and the resulting 3D reconstruction quality. So the research was looking at the influence of depth of field and sharpness on 3D reconstruction. We were focusing on aperture, angle, and distance. And this was to better understand those parameters and provide evidence of the limitations of depth of field relating to 3D. So we were looking at some lab tests with a planar surface it had a pseudo-random pattern on it with black and white that had been optimized for image matching. And we were also using a target that could record or provide information about 2D image quality assessment. And so we were connecting the 3D reconstructions of the planar test object with the results that we were getting for the 2D image quality. And so we were connecting those depth of field calculations with the required range of acceptable sharpness for 3D and the resulting 3D quality. So imaging techniques and technologies are important for the heritage field. They offer non-invasive, non-destructive, and in some cases, portable techniques as options to support the research and conservation of cultural heritage objects. And so my PhD research was focusing on consumer imaging systems, and the research was informing the improved documentation of heritage objects, focusing on increasing the accuracy and reliability of the image data as scientific records. And ultimately, the goal for conservation and heritage science is the stewardship of our cultural heritage and protecting it for future generations. And so the idea of, if we can optimize consumer imaging systems that are already being used by heritage professionals and for heritage documentation, then we can improve the recording, care, and understanding of these objects into the future. So for my work, an image is about image data as scientific records and the support of caring and protecting our cultural heritage. My focus has been on techniques and technologies that are accessible to conservators and heritage professionals, and that's based on cost and complexity. And then my research has been about improving documentation of heritage objects and increasing the accuracy and reliability of those. And so in thinking about how we can improve images as scientific records, the research was looking at establishing best practices, optimizing and developing workflows, understanding the imaging systems and quantifying the imaging systems, and that was about the camera characterization, and then tying the information about what I had talked about with cultural heritage imaging and that importance of the digital provenance information and data transparency, and including a lot of the information about the acquisition into the metadata. So this presentation only started to touch on some of the topics and issues that I'm really interested in investigating in. The presentation did not confront or try to broach the problematic histories of museums and photography, but I think that those are really important in considering the truth, the authority, the power, and the privilege of photography. And so I think that it's important to keep thinking about what an object is and how we're using images in the broader sense. So who is telling the story? What are we photographing and why? How can we acknowledge our power and privilege in the recording of heritage objects and in our imaging practices? And how can we continue to improve the records that we are creating? So I really enjoyed the opportunity to pull this presentation together. And I really look forward to jumping into some of these questions a bit further. So I hope that I was able to push you to think a little bit differently about images, to reflect on what an image is, the importance of imaging within cultural heritage, and then also those considerations for making images more reliable as records, as scientific records. There's a lot of support behind the work that I do and the research that I did. So thank you to the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute and the support from them, the access to collections and collaborations with the National Museum of American Indian and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The PhD was done with multiple partners and multiple advisors, so this couldn't have been done without them. And there are also people who have impacted my work and research that are no longer here with us today. And so those include Mel Wachowiak, David Arnold, and Dean Few. So thank you, and I think we'll have time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Keats. That was very interesting. I loved how you connected your artistic sensibilities with your scientific work, and seeing this continuum is fascinating. I'm sure there will be several questions. Can I remind you, please, when you type your questions, if you could briefly state what's your institution, that's sometimes very useful to know the context and interpret it a little bit better, if applicable, of course. Any questions for Keats? Great, we have one from Richard Grove from CIHA. Is there a workflow for camera characterization following modification that we can access? It's a long question, Keats, so maybe you can see it as well if you don't understand.
Oh, the question's longer than that?
Yes, and then he asks, I have been working on adapting a range of cameras for NIR and FIR imaging, and he wants to look at how these cameras are now performing.
Yeah, so there is a paper out that was part of the International Society of Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing that talks about kind of the process that we were using for camera characterization. So there's not like a very set workflow that's out there, but there are the different aspects that we were looking at, and that was tying in. A lot of my research was looking at these three main categories of museum imaging, and that's conservation documentation, scientific imaging, and then kind of collections photography. And so for the 2D image quality assessment, we were looking at targets from the kind of catalog exhibition photography, and they have standards and best practices. So we were using that target. The spectral sensitivity was looking more at imaging science and how to record that with a filter-based method, which is like kind of accessible, but filters are very expensive. So it's not, there's kind of compromises that are, to me, made with that. So there, Richard, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that if you want more specifics. Hopefully that gave like a very general overview.
While participants type the next questions, I'll ask one of my own. I was wondering whether you would have any comments on the types of skills that are necessary when someone learns to do this kind of imaging. Is an education that involves only the technical part of it incomplete? In other words, the elements that made you a photographer before a scientific imager, do you think they are necessary in order to do a good job?
I don't think it's necessary. I think the biggest thing about the work that I do is actually collaboration. So I think you do need some of the technical background in order to run some of these techniques, but there's also the aspect of interpretation. And so the Museum Conservation Institute is pretty much like a support unit for 19 museums. There are 19 museums within the Smithsonian. So we are not looking at the same materials or the same objects any day in a row. And so we're not, I'm not a material expert in any of those things. So the interpretation of the images that I take have to be done in collaboration with the conservators or with the scientists or researchers that have experience in that. And so I think that it's a slightly different answer to what Joseph was asking, but I think that collaboration really ties into what's needed for some of these imaging techniques.
Thanks, Keats. Now questions are piling up. I hope we have time to go through them. When it comes to people documenting their heritage, how do you think we as heritage professionals can use that data and go beyond the aesthetic values of that heritage?
I think that's a huge question, and I think there's such a variety of different imaging techniques. So there's kind of the spectral imaging techniques and broadband techniques that are going to provide different answers than something like multispectral imaging or hyperspectral imaging that are narrow bands and can be linked to better identification. And then there's kind of the 2.5D or 3D imaging. So there I think are a lot of questions that can be answered, and I don't think that there's a simple answer for that.
A question from Jessica, an ISH student at UCL. She says, thank you for the fascinating talk. Do you think that the camera modifications that you have used within the studio could also be used to document built heritage in an urban environment?
Yeah, I mean, they probably could. I think it's kind of what kind of questions are you trying to ask and answer, and would they be relevant for those questions? I think in some cases, yes, they could be. I'm trying to run through my brain really quickly to think of examples, but I'm not coming up with anything straight away. There definitely are instances where, yes, I think so, yes.
One question from Elena Rezivina. I'm not sure I understand. I don't know if you see it. She says, can holographic images be used? I don't know what a holographic image is. If that speaks to you, go ahead.
I actually don't know what those are either.
Elena, if you can clarify, or maybe you mean holographic, I'm not sure, but do clarify if necessary. And then we'll go back to it if we understand later. There's another question from Professor Adam Gibson from UCL. You have described very nicely how you're both an imaging scientist and an art photographer. For the benefit of those of us who are less talented than you, it is possible for someone to be a successful imaging scientist without being an artist. Can someone be a successful artist without also understanding the science? Thanks, Adam. That's what I was trying to ask as well, and I couldn't phrase it as well as you did.
Oh. Yes, I mean, I think so, but I think in both cases, having additional information or experience enhances what you're able to do with the other. So I think that you could be a successful imaging scientist without being an artist, or you could be a successful artist without being an imaging scientist. But I think that expanded knowledge and expanded experience increases your abilities with either subject or field. And I believe, like, some of the scientific images are beautiful objects in of themselves. There's a scientist at the Smithsonian who does X-rays of like the fish collection, and those are stunning, and they're hung up in frames along our hallways at work, and they're just really beautiful images.
Thank you very much, Keats. Oh no, there's one, and maybe it's going to be the last one considering the time. So just in time, Scott. This question is from Scott, our lecturer at UCL. Is there a dark side to the history of imaging in cultural contexts and institutions? Has this been explored in any books or resources that you could recommend?
Yes, I think there is. I have not been able to dive into that as much as I would have liked to for this presentation. And that is something that I want to look into, because I think that that really ties into the power and privilege of both photography and then the institutions that we work for. So better understanding this this history and this other side of it. I am only starting to gather kind of my resources and books for that, so I don't yet have anything to share, but Scott, I can send some your way as I pull this together. So thank you for that question. And thank you everyone for those questions. Sorry I haven't been thanking you for the questions.
I think we can actually answer an standing one. Maybe there's a minute to do this. But that's absolutely the last one. That's by Mattia, and a professor at ISH. Says an amazing talk, Keats. Methodologically, do you see a big difference between point spectroscopy, 2D or 3D imaging? In other words, why do those of us, perhaps just Mattia, and I think I see myself in this as well, his words, not mine. Why does a spectroscopy feel so different to hyperspectral imaging? Why do sometimes spectroscopists feel inadequate when they use hyperspectral imaging?
I mean, I think it's the difference of using a single spot with like hundreds of thousands of points. And so part of some of the like larger imaging techniques has to do with taking into consideration all of those different data points. And so in just thinking about maybe 3D imaging, there's a really big importance about the lighting of that object when you acquire that data. And if that lighting is off, your data is going to be off. But if you are only getting one point, lighting that point correctly is a lot easier than lighting thousands of points. And so I think that like that's not a complete answer, but I think that's starting to answer what Mattia was putting out there.
Excellent. Yes, it does feel that in hyperspectral imaging there are all these feedback loops between what you see and what you do that you don't consider so much when you do point analysis, isn't it? And then we have, I keep saying it's the last question. Now I'm serious. I see there's 1 minute left. That's Olivia from Rochester Institute of Technology. She thanks you for the fascinating talk and says, you mentioned that your work is informed by collaboration. How do you best meet people where they are at? And when you are conversing with people from such different disciplines? And I think that's a very nice question to end with.
It's a fantastic question. I think one benefit I have is that I was trained on some of these techniques without fully understanding how to use them initially. So I came to the Smithsonian about 10 years ago as an unpaid intern and was trained on some of these techniques just as a technician. And so I learned how to talk to people about them, not knowing the sophisticated algorithms or science that went behind them. And so I learned how to talk about them before I knew much about them. And so I think that helps in approaching some people and having a kind of a vocabulary that came before and then kind of a more informed approach right now. But this is a really important question. And I think it's just listening and asking questions and trying to see where maybe even just like repetition, like, is this what you're asking, to make sure that what you're listening is actually how you're thinking about it. Because I think sometimes we can hear something and we associate it with what we want to hear and we may interpret it differently. So if you can repeat it and talk about it and make sure that that's where you're at. So that communication with collaboration.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keats. I suggest then we leave it here. If there are other questions that you want to type, we'll forward them to Keats so she could respond to you via email. Thank you very much for coming. I'll just end by saying that this is obviously the last lecture before Christmas. The next one is going to be on the 28th of January. There's going to be Professor Ben Kamkin. So I hope you're going to join us for this one as well. You'll see the abstract in our website. The recording of this lecture is also going to be available there. Thank you very much, Keats. A virtual round of applause, and I'll see everyone after Christmas. Have a very good break.